Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to another installment of A Date with Darkness podcast. If you are tuning in for the first time, welcome. And for those of you who have been long-time listeners, thank you so much for continuing to rock with me. I appreciate you. How's everybody doing? Hope that you're doing well, staying safe in today's world. And thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your day to check in with us. Of course, we have another great show planned. And today's guest, I'm just gonna kind of go ahead and go into the interview here because I'm super excited about this interview. It's been an interview that it's been a minute in the making, I should say. And today's guest I have is Anna from Betrayal Trauma Recovery podcast. And that's a very popular podcast. And I'm super excited to have Anna on today because she and I, we do similar work and have similar content. We're both passionate about trauma, coerciveness, and abuse, and sort of fighting that fight. And so she and I got along really well, and it was such a refreshing interview to have with her, and I just felt like the vibe was immaculate. So our topic today is, and again, this is a topic and where I definitely want to, definitely want to put a listener advisory on this because it is a heavy topic, and we do talk about sexual coercion in relationships and specifically marriage. I think this is an important topic to cover because this is an important element of abuse that we must go into. I've had sexual content on the show before, but this is a different style because I think a lot of times when you're married, there's this expectation that you will have sex with your spouse, and that if one partner doesn't want to have it and the other partner does, well, you should do it anyway to fulfill your marital duties. And even if you're not motivated or you don't want to, if your partner demands it, then that's their right to do that. And so Anna and I really sort of break it down. She talks about her own experience with that. We don't get into too many technical legalities, but we do talk about that a little bit. And I think, if this is something that you struggle with, sexual coercion, I strongly encourage you to reach out to a therapist who is trained in that, or to even reach out to a crisis line and speak with someone about that. So the first organization that I want to mention is RAIN.org. They're an excellent organization online that has plenty of tips and resources and can clarify other things around sexual coercion, sexual assault. Is RAIN.org, and that's RAINN.org. I will also put that in the show notes. You can also contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which is 800-799-7233. And again, I will link those down in the show notes. And so Anna and I share some information about this. And one of the things I definitely also want to mention in this interview is, again, we're talking about, um, uh, your typical heteronormative male-female relationship. This podcast is in no way meant to it's not meant to stigmatize men or to make men out to be evil. We're just talking about relationships that she and I can identify with. It's also not meant to isolate others. This could absolutely be applicable to same sex relationships. Also, regarding statutes, laws, and things like that around sexual coercion, every state is different around this. It still does not mean that it's okay. It does not mean that you should not reach out for help or get some sort of assistance in addressing this matter. This is a very serious issue. And so I want to jump right into the interview. And of course, if this interview is very triggering to you, please be sure to take care of yourselves. You do not have to listen to it. You can skip through the parts that are very challenging for you, or you can skip this episode entirely. So I definitely want to preface that. And so here we are. Hello and welcome to the show, Anne. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. I'm excited that we get to talk today. You and I have kind of been doing similar shows, similar content. So I think it's just a match made in heaven.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for your work. You have helped so many people. So thank you. It's an honor to be here today.
Yes, and likewise. Thank you. So tell us who you are and what you do and the passion behind your work.
So I'm Anne Blythe, which is not my real name, but I want to protect myself online. And that comes from the book Anne of Green Gables.
My favorite when I was a kid.
Well, and we're all kindred spirits who have been through this, right? And so I just wanted all women to know that we were kindred spirits and we're all kind of in the same boat, regardless of where we came from, where we live, our religious background, anything like that.
Yeah.
I wanted everyone to feel welcome. And I did not know that I was being emotionally and psychologically abused as well as sexually coerced for all 7 years of my marriage. And I went down the pornography addiction recovery route with my ex-husband, thinking that if we could get him in recovery or if he would just stop looking at porn or whatever, that we could solve this problem that we had, right? Not recognizing that it was abuse. And what alarmed me the most is that once I realized it was abuse, he was actually eventually arrested for domestic violence. He is an attorney, so it was not like overt domestic. It wasn't overt physical violence. It was definitely like emotional and psychological violence. But he sprained my fingers, and I took myself to the Instacare and said, hey, this was domestic violence. They arrested him. He was only out of the house for I got a protective order, but that gave me enough space to really realize all the psychological abuse that had been happening, which was mainly actually not the issue, but physical violence never happens without emotional and psychological abuse as well.
Absolutely.
And I haven't been severely physically harmed, so I do not mean to discount physical abuse, but in my experience, it seems like that is a little bit easier to deal with because it's more obvious and it's more like it might not be easy to recover if you're
they can see the evidence
broken or something. Yeah. But in terms of knowing what actually happened, so that tipped me off to being like, oh, maybe he's abusive. So I started reading about abuse, and then I was just floored that I had been trying to face these issues head on, going to multiple therapists, trying to get help for years, and no one told me that I was being abused. And I thought, I have to get the word out. To go to a pornography addiction recovery or sex addiction recovery services for 7 years, and no one tells me that I'm being abused is insane. I was just floored. So I had to get the word out that what does emotional and psychological abuse look like in the context of betrayal, porn use, infidelity, affairs, prostitution, that type of thing. So that is what Betrayal Trauma Recovery specializes in, is the emotional and psychological abuse and sexual coercion that takes place when your husband is using porn or having affairs. Now, I say that because we only deal specifically with women who have been betrayed by men. But that's not to say that women don't use porn or they don't have affairs or that men aren't abused sometimes, but just our organization, that is our specific thing that we deal with. I just stay within that. What's the word? I don't know how to deal with those other things. So we're experts in helping women.
Yeah. Which is what you know, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's nothing wrong with that. I love that. I think, just from hearing you talk, you spoke about something interesting that I get it. And experts who work in the field get it, but not a lot of common people understand that it's a thing, which is sexual coercion in marriage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about what that is and what that looked like for you?
So sexual coercion in marriage is actually very simple and also super complex at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about sexual coercion or rape, the word consent comes up a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so people think, yeah, I'm consenting. I consented to marry this person, right? But they don't realize that maybe they didn't have all the information that they needed in order to make a wise decision about marrying that person. So for example, and then I'll talk specifically about sex in just a minute, but just to talk about marriage for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of religious women, they attend church every week. Their fiance attends church every week. Their fiance is pulling out the Bible. Their fiance is praying. Their fiance is talking about Jesus, or, we have Jewish women who follow us. So they're going to the synagogue and, all of that stuff. And so there's this implied assumption that because they are attending church and they're reading the Bible or whatever they're doing, that they are a God-fearing / obedient type person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. So they assume they might not ask them outright, hey, do you go to strip clubs? Or do you view pornography? Or they might not ask them that, but the persona that the man is portraying is someone of faith and someone who would not do those types of things. Mm-hmm. And so that in and of itself is a consent issue, because what they are portraying to be and what they actually are two different things. And so the women are not given enough information to actually give consent, even if they are consenting. So the first one is that they marry them in the first place under false pretenses. It's actually fraud in some ways. And people, it's interesting because people will be like, well, you can't know everything about a person. I'm like, yeah, but these are major issues. This isn't just like, oh yeah, and by the way, I really don't like the color, coral, who cares? That doesn't matter. This isn't like that. This is a lifestyle issue, and it's really big
risk too. It can be a health risk depending on how aversive the behavior is.
Absolutely. And it's also a consent issue. Mm-hmm. It's very, very serious. So there's that. And then there's the sex part, which would be that anytime anyone has sex, whether they be married or not, you need to have consent. But that also means you need to have all the information to give consent. So if an example I'd like to give is, let's say that's someone who, I deal with a lot of religious women mm-hmm. who don't want to have sex until they're married. But let's pretend like it's someone who's just is not is fine with having sex, but they just want to make sure that the person that they're having sex with is someone they want to have a relationship with. All right. So let's say they go on 5 dates, and on all the dates, the person has pulled up in a Tesla. Okay. And he's talked about his job at Google. And he has talked about, his apartment and everything. And you think, wow, this guy's he's kind, he's nice. And so on the 5th date, you're like, man, I really can see this going somewhere. I think I'm going to consent to have sex with him. Right. So then you have sex. All right. But you're like, I consented. I said, yes. I said, yeah, I want to start like a serious relationship with you. But let's pretend like it was not his Tesla. He borrowed it from a friend and he drove it every time, and that he didn't work at Google at all, and that he was married with kids, right? If you would have known all of that, would you have consented? And the answer is no. You thought you were going to be able to have a serious relationship. Also, maybe he said that, like, I'm really looking for a serious relationship and you might be the one or whatever. And he was just lying to you to manipulate you to have sex. So that happens to a lot of women where they feel like, oh, this guy's so wonderful. He's amazing. Whether they be married or no, I feel safe enough to consent to have sex. They do. And then later they find out, wait a minute, I didn't know all of this stuff. That is sexual coercion. And women feel like they have been raped. And it is because that is what rape is essentially, is when you are forced or coerced to have sex with someone who you really wouldn't feel comfortable having sex with. So it's kind of after the fact, you feel like, whoa, right? Like that feels bad. I don't like that. I feel coerced. And people aren't taking it very seriously. Mm-mm. It's like, well, you said in the moment, yes. And you're like, yeah, but all of the surrounding things around it. So you take that to a marriage situation where, that was your initial question, right? Sexual coercion in marriage. So she thinks she's married to this man who doesn't use porn. He's not lying to her. He's not manipulating. He's a kind, loving husband, but the kindness is not real. It's false. It's a grooming tactic to just manipulate her into not knowing that he's living a double life. Maybe he has, in Omar Minwala's words, a secret sexual basement happening. And then not knowing that perhaps he's soliciting prostitutes or something. If she really knew the truth about what he was doing and who he was and how he was actually treating her, what he actually felt about her, she would probably not consent. And that is why it's coercion. And men can coerce women in marriage for years, and they don't even know it. They don't know they're being sexually coerced, and they don't know they're being emotionally and psychologically abused, because that type of behavior is severe psychological abuse.
I would agree with you. I think that's one element of sexual coercion that happens in marriage. I think there's other types of coercion, but I think you broke a lot of it down very eloquently. But I think there's also the expectation that because you're married, we have to have sex, right? And sometimes that could be, when the person wants it, right? So the option is not to say no. So now you're faced with sort of, you might be faced with someone who sort of has this other identity, but then you're also faced with the task that you can't really say no when you're married.
Yeah, well, and there's even a more simple version of sexual coercion in marriage, which could be, let's pretend like he's not using porn. Let's pretend like he's not lying. He's not manipulating. He's not doing any of that. Let's just pretend that comes in and says, hey, we should have sex tonight. And she's like, I don't want to. And he says, well, I don't feel loved when we don't have sex. That, like, if we don't have sex, I'll be grumpy and I won't. And he's not mean. He's not yelling at her or something, but like coercing her to do something that she doesn't really want to do, making her feel like there will be consequences if I don't do this. And I remember feeling that I didn't really understand coercion. I didn't really understand consent. There's so many things I didn't understand when I was first married. And I felt like if I didn't, then he would maybe use porn, or maybe like he wouldn't have his needs met or something like that, not realizing like, wait, I have the need not to have sex. And his need to have sex and my need to not have sex are perfectly equal. And also, wait a minute, sex is not a need, right? Like if you don't have sex, you won't die. I mean, some people might feel like they will, but they won't. Their balls are not going to fall off. Yeah. They're not going to like, die. They will survive. And so it's more of a desire than a need. And I think that's another dangerous sort of thing floating out there right now, is that these sexual needs are like eating. And if you don't provide for that, then you're like depriving someone of like a basic human need, like shelter or food. And that is not the case.
Yes, I 1,000% agree with you. And, there was something else that you said that really, really struck out at me. And in my experience, I've worked a lot with men also. So I've worked on both sides of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. What I have found in my work of doing this for years as a therapist and working with people who have sexual addictions and who've had other types of addictions is I've noticed that with women specifically, women say we have to get help. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that all men don't, but I'm saying in the work that I've experienced, usually it's not like that. Mm-hmm. Usually the dynamics are much different in that you need to go get help. Mm-hmm. So I think that's an important piece to point out too, when women are being coerced. Mm-hmm. Psychologically, the desire is no, we mm-hmm. have to fix it. Mm-hmm. Like we've got to work on it. And usually that we meaning me. I mean, mm-hmm. in their mind, they're thinking we as a couple got to do it. But really, in reality, that we is really meaning I have to fix it. Even if I'm being abused or coerced or kind of going through this thing, I have to rush in and I'm gonna help this person fix themselves and ultimately fix us.
Yes. Yeah. I think what's happening there, and I'm not sure how you feel about this, but is that they innately know something's wrong.
Oh,
they
course.
Absolutely are feeling like something is not right here. They just do not know that it's abuse. And with not you specifically, but many therapists that they might go to, they might not identify the abuse to them, right? And so I'm so grateful that as a therapist, you can recognize that, because that's awesome. And so because they might go in for like couple therapy, for example, and the therapist might say, okay, well, you just have a communication issue. He's got these needs that aren't being met, and you have these needs, and let's try and get the needs met. And that is just the worst case scenario when someone is being abusive, because they can use the things that they've learned in that session to weaponize them and harm the victim even more. Yep. There is no way to solve an abuse problem or a coercion problem through communication, through, the classic church things you hear, like love, serve, and forgive. You can't communicate your way out of abuse. You can't love, serve, and forgive your way out of abuse. And it's not a we problem. And the more an abuser loves it when a victim thinks it's our problem, mm-hmm. because that she's squarely in the vortex of abuse. And that really, really works for the abuser, and it doesn't get the victim out. And I think that's one of the misconceptions that victims have, especially when they don't understand abuse dynamics, or even if they know they're being abused, is they think, I can just go to him and say, hey, this is abuse. Yep. Listen to all these reasons, read this book. And then he'll be like, oh, I didn't realize I was being abusive. I love you. Okay, I'll stop. And that is not how this works.
That is not how it works at all. And I think, yes, you're right in that people don't know that they're being abused. It's one of the reasons why I stopped doing couples therapy years ago. I don't do it anymore because of the coercive control element. And I do recognize that if you are being abused, therapy can be weaponized against you. The other piece of it is when you say we, again, we meaning me, that person also has to do their fair share of work, right? And normally when you're doing it as a victim, you're still overcompensating and trying to help make things work for your abusive partner.
Well, many abusers, they want
Absolutely.
the victim to manage all of these
Yeah.
things, right? And so even if they're willing to go to therapy, for example, if the victim is setting up the therapy appointments and
Finding the
managing all of the
therapist.
things.
Yes, finding
Yeah.
the therapist,
So,
doing the
and
research.
my ex was like the shining star in therapy. I mean, he was all the therapists thought he was amazing. He was so self-reflective and understanding. And why wasn't I progressing? You know, why couldn't I like see what a great guy he was and help him out? And, and because of that element of I had to do my part, or I had to stay on my side of the street in the 12-step framework or something like that, it just continually gave him a crack in the door that of course he pushed wide open to not take accountability, to continue to blame me if something doesn't go. If someone else is doing everything, then they're also responsible, and you can continue to blame the other person for, you can continue to blame the victim for all of the things that are going wrong.
Absolutely. And that's the thing that I think a lot of victims, as are kind of going through it, a lot of victims are, sort of in the mindset that it's me, there's something wrong and I have to fix it. He has a problem, and I'm speaking it again in heteronormative terms here, and I'm saying he and this and that, but I recognize just for simplicity's sake, I recognize this could be interchangeable, but it's this sort of conception or this sort of notion that my partner doesn't have that awareness, or they have that problem and I have to fix it. But people are not dumb. When you are with an abuser, it's not that they don't have insight. They're fully aware of what they're doing. They don't necessarily want to be the ones to do the work. And I say that necessarily because you do have some people that are willing to do the work and change, but more times than not, that's not usually the case. They don't want to do the work. They're just going to continue to manipulate and do all those things, which is again why your ex showed up as the shining star. They're fully aware of what the problem is. They're fully aware of what they're doing. They're fully aware of the hypocrisy that comes up, but they're not interested in that. They're not interested in changing or taking accountability or admitting that they have a problem. Yeah, they'll show up and do this just to appease you for 1 or 2 sessions, and then that's it.
Or mine got so much validation from the therapist. He loved going to therapy. He could go to therapy, all day long because it was just a fun, like, I'm awesome session for him. I think the thing it really comes down to is that exploitative privilege.
Yes.
They would have to give that up. They would have to say, I am unwilling now, and I am going to freely sacrifice my exploitative privilege in order to not be exploitative anymore. And because I deal solely with women who are victims of men, the societal misogyny, institutional misogyny always comes into this, because that exploitative privilege of like, well, you're a woman, and so you're supposed to make dinner. That's your job. I mean, that's just exploitative privilege. It's just a basic daily task. It doesn't matter who does it. It needs to get done. And it's not a woman's job to do that. It just needs to get done. And you can share those tasks, right? It's also not a woman's job period, end of story, to satisfy a man's sexual desires. It's not. If she chooses to do that, fine, but it's not her duty. It's not her job. It's not, anything like that. That is for a committed, healthy, connected couple to decide in that moment if that is a good moment for them. But it's not like her wifely duty, right?
Yeah.
So there's all of these misogynistic sort of societal / institutional. And when I say institutional, it could be church or it could be other institutions.
Yes.
It's really weird because it's like the churches have this sort of misogyny going on, like you've got to submit, that kind of thing. But then so do secular places, like, well, men have these base needs that have to be filled and pornography is normal, or like we're just animals, or something like that. So there's it's kind of coming from everywhere that women are required or have these certain jobs or these certain things that they need to do. And women and abusive men feel entitled. They feel like, this is my privilege to have you have sex with me. I am entitled to these things and you're not giving them to me. And I think that's another part of this that's interesting, is that when a woman is just she's just wanting to do her thing, if he feels like his exploitative privilege is threatened, if he feels like, no, I'm entitled to have you make dinner for me, like what is going on? He feels like a victim, even though he's not. He feels like he's being abused. So that's why we get a lot of well, she's an abuser too, because she doesn't do this and she doesn't do that. And really, it's usually a thing that he thinks he's entitled to that he's not, that she doesn't want to do, or it's actually a response to his abuse. So he lies to her and then she gets upset and then he says, well, she yells at me, but you're like, this is self-defense. It's not abuse. This is not what's happening here. And so I think that's another thing to throw out there, is a lot of people will be like, well, he accuses me of being an abuser too. And so are we just both abusive?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is no. No, you're right.
Yeah. And I totally agree with that. And I think, when you're dealing with these types of things, there's a difference between expectations and values.
Mm-hmm.
Values are what's at your core and what you believe and what you would do in your day-to-day life without your partner. So this is just who you are as a person without your partner or without anybody else. What do you value in your life? And then there's expectations. And expectations usually come from somewhere else. Right. And a lot of times you have all these other sort of influences when it comes to expectations, such as what you're talking about: societal, family, church, just how you could sort of, how you can have the perfect relationship or be the perfect partner that's usually how we filter expectations. And it's so interesting as we're talking about sexual coercion. I don't know if you are on TikTok or not, or if you sort of watch it. I was looking at, or if, I meant kind of just going through it.
Oh, watching it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So I watch it, sometimes, just to kind of just get creative juices going. And I was looking at a video. I think it's a male podcast. That's also a very interesting concept, where as we're talking about misogyny, and this particular podcast is very misogynist, and they were talking about sexual behaviors in marriages and relationships. And one guy was up there and he was talking to the podcast host, and he was like, he was asking his partner about what her sexual fantasies were. And the host is like, why would you do that? Why would you ask her? Why does that even matter? And I thought that's very interesting. And there seemed to be a lot of agreement and engagement with him in terms of why would you sort of ask that?
And I kind of like, why would a woman's sexual desires even matter?
Right.
That kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And why is a male partner, why would I be asking that, she should just be fulfilling mine.
Yeah.
And I don't want this to turn into a male bashing show, because that's not what this is, and that's not what it's intended for.
No.
But I just thought it was very interesting how I'm like, wow, people really sort of believe that. And like, he got a lot of support for that. And the other guy that was like talking about why he would do it this way actually got bashed a lot for it. And I was just thought that that was the most interesting thing. But I think also too, it kind of goes into those sort of old school expectations that people have in terms of how they show up in a relationship, because I'm quite sure there's people that may listen to this and think, when you're married, there is no such thing as coercion or rape.
Yeah. And that is just not true.
It's not, but it's very, very old school. And, you know, it even
Well,
shows up
I don't,
systemically.
yeah, I was going to say, I don't even know if it's old school.
Yeah.
I think lots of wives out there, lots of them don't, I mean, they might not, even if they're not in a, you know, like super abusive marriage or something.
Absolutely.
They don't really want to have sex, but they feel like they need to because they love their husband and they care about him, and they would just feel bad if they didn't.
Right.
Even that just like very little thing can be coercion. It can also just be a kind gesture to your spouse. I mean, this isn't, that's why it's so simple and yet so complex at the same time. Right. Because like, an example I might say is I genuinely hate basketball. I'm not married. But let's pretend like I was married to someone who loved basketball. Right. And I would be like, well, you can just watch basketball by yourself. Right. Like, just you go to the games with your friends. And if he was like, well, it would really mean a lot to me if you came to like one game a month. Right. I might be like, sure, I'll go to one game a month, even though I genuinely hate it, but because I love you. The problem with sex is if you're like, you know, I don't want to have sex with you right now. Unlike basketball, it's not like he can be like, okay, well, I'm just going to go have sex with this other person. Like basketball, he can be like, well, I'll go watch the game with my friends.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why men, again, speaking in a gender segregated way, but that's not saying that this doesn't happen with women, but might be like, well, if she doesn't want to, I can't do it. And then they just get really angry or very like, I am entitled to this and you are stopping me from doing this. And so because I deserve it, or because this is a need, I have to do it somewhere else, or you're not giving me like, I'm, you know, what I am entitled to. And that is just not true. It's not true. And it's not the case. And it's, you know, like no one would say it's no, well, maybe someone would, but I me as a mother, I wouldn't be like, oh, my poor 20-year-old son who is not married and he can't get sex from someone. And so he's just got to go out and get a prostitute. Like, I'd be like, no, I hope he remains celibate until he finds a healthy relationship. Right. I mean, and so, if your relationship isn't healthy enough, if she doesn't feel safe, if she doesn't feel valued, she's not really going to be that into sex because shouldn't be. Like, he's not entitled to it. Sex is it's when I say exploitative privilege, I do mean it like, I don't mean it like this. Sorry. It's a privilege to be able to have sex, in that you're not entitled to that, but it comes with all the other things. It has to be healthy. It has to be, you know, vulnerable and real and authentic. Like, that is what sex is about. If it's coerced, like, it's not really intimate. It's just like a physical act, which is not what women want. Right? Women don't want that.
Absolutely. And I definitely want to make the distinction here about the coerciveness versus deprivation. Have a partner that's just not willing to engage with you at all, and there's no sort of coercion or any of that going, in terms of the other partner, this is not applicable. I feel like that's a totally different thing. And I definitely want to make the distinction so that people are not confused by that.
I want to agree. Unfortunately, though, abusers use that as a weapon to say, well, I'm not coercing her. I am loving, I am caring. And she's just unwilling and she won't engage. And she might actually think that that's what she's doing. She might think, I don't engage. I don't want to have sex. She might not know why, but it might, in that scenario, it's because she feels unsafe. It's because she's being abused. So I think that's super important to make that distinction. The only problem, so many books say this does not apply if there's abuse, right? Or don't do if this is abuse. But then because a woman doesn't know she's being abused, she usually like kind of goes to those things. So it makes it very, very tricky to ferret out what's happening.
And I would say that because every case is different, this is where I'll put the disclaimer in. This is definitely where you want to seek out your own individual therapy and work with someone who is experienced and trained in that. Because I work a lot with people that are or have been sexually coerced, and they do. You're right. They feel just like that. And that can be the problem with self-help. There's a lot of great self-help tools out there, but self-help tools are very general. And it's not, when it comes to your relationship and your situation, it's not always a one size fits all, and all the rules aren't necessarily applicable. So that's what I'll say there. In your opinion, as you had a show about this on whether or not, how you feel in terms of abusers and are they capable of change? What are your thoughts about that? Because I'd love to hear.
So this is such a hard question because I do think they are capable of change. I have this hope in humanity that just humanity in general can improve over time, that all of us can become better people, and that people can change. It's just a core, like in my soul. I need to believe that in order to have hope for the world. Now, there's such a difference between believing that and then someone having already changed. So the problem with the someone can change idea is that abusers use that as a way to continue to hoover back in their victims. But also so does like maybe clergy, like, oh, don't you believe in like the redemption of Christ, or something like that. Like, and a victim can be like, well, I do believe that like Christ could help heal us. Let's say they're Christian, or even self-help, that like, yes, anyone can make or changes, or, it doesn't matter what type of like, oh, with therapy, they could get better or something like that. Right. The difference is they haven't changed yet. So they're still abusive, and being able to determine whether or not someone is healthy or someone is abusive is a super important skill. So if they are saying this right after an abuse episode, or is it part of a pattern, or they're saying, I'll never look at porn again, or, whatever the thing is, the only things that you can use to know are observing their behavior and observing the patterns, and then observing them over time. And waiting, like watching, and I think from a safe distance. So create some type of mental or physical boundary for yourself so that you're safe. Depends on what that looks like. In fact, at BTR, we just came out with a new workshop that I'm super excited about. It's called Strategic Thought and Communication Tactics for Victims, to create enough space, even if you're still maybe in contact with them, so that you're safe from a distance. And then you can just observe. Because anytime you try to confront them or help them change or anything like that, you're just setting yourself up for more abuse. So really, like, get some distance, take a step back and observe for an extended amount of time. It could even be with no contact. I've been able to observe very keenly with almost basically no contact from a distance, because I share children with my X. And so I can just see from his behaviors, even if I don't talk to him, what is going on. And he confessed, he says to everyone, like, I've changed so much. I'm like, no, he's still exactly the same. But because I can observe that in his behavior.
Yeah.
So can people change? Yes. Has your abuser changed? You listeners, people who are listening right now. And the answer is no. They have not changed. If you're still experiencing, they're still lying, they're still gaslighting, they're still coercing you. Also, I think that victims can feel it in their bodies. They can sort of sense these like something isn't right. They haven't changed. It's okay to just get some space to see, but that I can change, or I will change, or I am changing, or I have changed is a classic manipulative tool that is super, super dangerous for victims.
I would agree with that. And I would also agree that, the consistency, seeing the consistency in the efforts to change over a long period of time, not the immediate, okay, well, I'll change for a little bit. And then as soon as we get back to where we're going, then I'm going to settle back into being the person that you've known all this time. And I would also say, again, I go back to abusers. Abusers do have the ability to be aware and cognizant of what they're doing. However, if they have the insight, insight is something totally different. But if they have the insight into why they're doing the things that they're doing, and sort of monitoring their behavior and making conscious effort to say, when this happened, this came up for me. And so I checked myself when that emotion came up for me, and I have now developed a healthier coping skill to now counteract that. That's that I think that's when we have that. So I think when people are taking that extra step to be, and not only that, but to be accountable for their behavior. So I think there's a few different layers there that happens, and it's not going to happen typically on their own. That's the other thing that people sort of fall into. I don't need therapy. I don't need, I've just been sort of doing my own thing, or I've gone to a couple of AA or some sort of meetings like that, and I've got it now, or I've got some sort of sponsor. That's not going to be the same thing. So yeah.
And I want to make, like, the classic abuse cycle is the abuse and then the honeymoon phase, right? Yes. And I don't really like the honey. I mean, I don't use that term honeymoon phase. What I like to call that phase is the grooming phase, because it's not like a honeymoon during that phase. It is like their niceness is grooming. It is abuse. It's like part of the abuse, right? Yeah. And so if depending on the abuser, so my abuser was like loved therapy, so he was able to learn all this therapy language, and then that's what he would say in the grooming phase. I recognize that I've done wrong. I recognize I need to change it. And then it was just part of the grooming phase, and then he'd go right back into the abuse. Yeah. And so it seemed maybe like a repair, but it was never a repair. It was just part of that grooming phase. So recognizing the patterns is super important too, because you can see, like, they might seem like they're self-aware. They might seem like they're apologizing. They might actually seem like their behavior is changing, but really this is just part of that pattern. Yep. And it's grooming. And now they've learned the therapy speak for it. Now they've learned the therapy language, but it actually hasn't helped them to give up their exploitative privilege. Yeah. They're just trying to get it a different way. So that's something to look for.
I agree. And I appreciate you pointing that out, because there's a difference between actual true insight, consistent behavior change, and mirroring. When you have someone that's just sort of like, I call it almost like being a puppet, just sort of puppeting back, or, just parroting back, what they heard, and it sounds good. And they're sort of, placating the situation. I think that there's a total difference between that and the actual change. And again, I think you're spot on when you were saying that people who are being abused, they know, like, you feel it in your body, knowing and wanting to believe it's true are two totally different things. And I think that's kind of where we can get into trouble, is that, okay, well, he says this, so I want to believe that that's true, even though in my heart of hearts or in the back of my mind, I still feel like something's amiss and we're not being totally honest with each other. So I think that's the key piece as well, is like looking at the facts, like you said, noticing the patterns, and not romanticizing or fantasizing about the potential or what you hoped it would be or what you hoped it would turn into.
Yeah. And it's so hard because women, they're generally speaking, our greatest desire is to keep our families together, right? We want, like, we're worried about our kids, we just want a stable home. And with an abuser, that's always used to manipulate us. And that's so hard because it's a good thing that we want, that society is like, yeah, good women want their families to stay together or whatever. And so it's playing off of our like really genuine and I'll say wholesome desire that are used against us in really scary, scary ways to manipulate us. And that is, that's so hard to be like, well, the thing that I want is a healthy family. And he keeps saying, oh, it'll be good. Of course I want our family to be together. But really that's just grooming, and he's harming us. Like, he's actually dangerous for our family. And in that case, if you decide to set boundaries, if you decide to separate, if you decide to divorce, whatever you decide, you haven't done anything to harm your family. The abuse is what harms the family, and you're setting boundaries and you maybe getting out or whatever you decide to do is actually you trying to save your family, you trying to save your own emotional and psychological sanity, and trying to protect your children from emotional and psychological abuse and somebody who is coercive. That is a family protective thing to do. So if you can channel that thought of like, but I want my family to be, I care about my family, try and be like, I care about my family so much that I'm going to protect my family from this type of abuse and this type of behavior. It is unacceptable and it is anti-family, right?
Absolutely. Well, we're at the end of the hour again. It went by fast, didn't it?
It did. You were so easy to talk to. So thank you.
You are as well. I love talking to you. You know what? I like in our conversation to, like, we're two girls. We went out to brunch and we had some mimosas. And we So I think it was a great conversation, and we'll definitely have to do it again. So for the listeners that are listening to you and they want to keep in touch with you and see what you're doing, tell us how they can find you, and if there's anything that you're working on that we can support you with.
Oh, that's awesome. So my podcast is on Apple Podcasts at btr.org or Betrayal Trauma Recovery. The website is btr.org. All of my podcast episodes are also transcribed so that you can read them on our website. We also have a daily support group for victims that runs like 4 times a day. Nice. So people are able to do BTR group sessions with our coaches and individual sessions there. Nice. Our coaches are specially trained in this type of trauma. They understand the abuse, and you can get in like immediately with them, which is nice. So those group sessions are really helpful for people who are kind of in like real like emergency mode, because we're kind of online live all the time there. Yeah. And you can find that group session schedule on our website at btr.org. And then the last thing is the new workshop that we've introduced, which is the strategic communication and thought tactics for victims to learn how to kind of interact with an abuser without confronting them about their abuse, so that you can stay safe and you don't set yourself up for more abuse, but also so you've got enough distance there that you're not being you're being harmed the least amount possible, because you've like put a shield around yourself. And that you can find on our website. As actually, I don't know if you can find it on our website right now, but if you follow us on Instagram at Betrayal Trauma Recovery or TikTok at btr.org, we do have the links there or on Facebook at Betrayal Trauma Recovery. So we're kind of all over the place, like you.
I love it. And I'll be sure to link everything down in the show notes so people can find it. So that way they can just zip right to it. So I love it. Thank you so much. And I appreciate you being on.
Thank you.
Would love to know what your thoughts are on the episode with Anna. Does this episode resonate with you? Did you find it to be helpful? If there's an organization that you have found to be helpful in your area, please be sure to drop that in the comments on social media and in the other platforms in which this podcast is aired so that folks can see. And of course, I always, I'm appreciative that you guys hung in there, and I want you guys to be sure to be kind to one another and take care of yourselves. And until next time, be well. Check out the sneak preview of next week's episode.
From my understanding of that literature, and I'm not an expert in this field, a lot of it is due to kind of cognitive confusion. So for instance, the bystander effect.
Yeah.
It's not so much that people don't care, but like if it's clear that you are the only one who's available to help, usually people do step in. So the bystander effect is kind of like, whose responsibility is it? And I'm kind of confused, and is this dangerous? So a lot of it is just kind of cognitive confusion that arises. Also, in terms of like turning away from abuse, and this is one of the things that got me to write my book, is the Me Too movement. A lot of it, again, is cognitive dissonance, which you probably know about, right? So cognitive dissonance means it's just so upsetting to see the truth that we don't see the truth because it's kind of easier to process. And so it's almost like we just turn away. It's not like we're saying, oh yeah, that's great. It's not that. We're just turning away because it's like too difficult to face it.